Picture this. A Toyota taxi rolls through the streets of Tokyo with over 500,000 miles on the exact same engine it left the factory with. Not rebuilt, not swapped the original block. The original pistons, still spinning smoothly after 500,000 miles of stop-and-go city driving. Now picture a Honda sedan in the same city, quietly sitting at 200,000 miles. And its owner still calls it middle-aged, not old, not tired. Middle-aged. Now look across the ocean. The average car in America is being hauled to the scrapyard somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 miles. Often with a blown transmission, a warped head gasket, or an engine that simply gave up. Same steel, same oil brands sitting on the same shelves. Same basic combustion engineering that hasn't fundamentally changed in decades. So why does one engine die in its adolescence while the other one is still going strong deep into what should be old age? The answer isn't a secret Japanese lubricant. It isn't a mystical part hiding under the hood. It's something far more uncomfortable to admit. A discipline most drivers outside Japan have never even been introduced to, one that traces back to a government law written 75 years ago, and a set of habits so small that most people would dismiss them as pointless if you tried to explain them on the street. By the end of this, you're going to look at your own car completely differently. And honestly, you might feel a little guilty about how you've been treating it. Stick around, because we're going to go deep into details almost nobody covers when this topic comes up. And if engineering explanations that actually change how you take care of your own vehicle are your kind of thing, do yourself a favor and follow along so you don't miss what comes next. Because this is only the beginning of the rabbit hole. The lie everyone believes about motor oil. Here's the myth almost everyone operates under. Oil wears out because of miles. Drive enough distance, the oil gets dirty, you change it. Simple, except that belief is only half true, and the missing half is exactly why so many engines die young. Oil doesn't just degrade from friction and mileage. It degrades from heat cycling. Every single time an engine starts cold and reaches operating temperature, then cools back down, the oil's molecular structure takes a small hit. The additive package inside that oil, the detergents, the anti-wear compounds, the acid-neutralizing agents, starts breaking down not because the car moved far, but because the engine got hot and cold. Over and over again. This is why a car stuck in dense urban gridlock, crawling at 10 miles an hour with the engine constantly idling and reheating, can chemically wreck its oil in 3,000 miles. While a car cruising at a steady 70 on the highway might barely stress that same oil at 6,000. The number on the odometer lies to you. It tells you nothing about what's actually happening at the molecular level inside your crankcase. There's a measurement mechanics rarely explained to regular drivers called total base number, or TBN. It's essentially a score of how much acid-fighting capacity is left in your oil. Fresh oil might start around a TBN of 10 or 12. As combustion byproducts, sulfur compounds, and moisture accumulate, that number drops once it falls low enough. The oil stops protecting your engine from corrosive acids and simply becomes contaminated lubricant sitting in your crankcase, doing almost nothing useful. Most drivers will never once check this number in the entire life of their car. Japanese maintenance culture essentially treats the interval itself as a proxy for TBN decline, changing the oil before that chemical protection ever runs out, rather than waiting to find out the hard way. The 3,000-mile discipline. This is the foundation beneath what's often called the Japanese approach to oil changes. Instead of chasing the manufacturer's maximum posted interval, which on many modern vehicles can stretch to 7,000, 10,000, even 15,000 miles, Japanese drivers commonly change oil at roughly 5,000 kilometers, which lands just over 3,000 miles, and they don't treat that as a magic number carved in stone. Short city commutes with constant cold starts get shortened further. Long, steady highway stretches earn a bit more slack. If you're already thinking that sounds excessive, you're not alone. Plenty of engineers will point out that modern full synthetic oils can technically survive 10,000 miles without falling apart. And they're right. The oil itself might still pass a laboratory test at that mileage. But here's what almost nobody says out loud. Surviving is not the same as protecting optimally. Fresh oil doesn't just lubricate moving parts, it actively cleans. Every single mile it circulates, it's carrying away microscopic metal shavings created by ordinary wear, neutralizing acids produced by combustion, and helping pull heat away from the engine block. The fresher that oil stays, the better every one of those jobs gets performed. Now stretch that difference across 200,000 miles. 300,000 miles. Imagine two identical engines rolling off the exact same assembly line on the exact same day. One gets fresh oil every 3,000 miles for its entire life. The other rides the manufacturer's maximum interval of 10,000. At 200,000 miles, the first engine still sounds tight, smooth, almost quiet at idle. The second one is already burning a quart of oil every 1,000 miles by 120,000. Its bearing clearances have widened from years of degraded lubrication, and it's staring down an expensive rebuild. Same metal, same design, completely different outcome purely from how often the fluid protecting it stayed fresh. The law that forces an entire nation to care, but the oil change interval is only the surface. Underneath it sits something far more structural. A government inspection system so strict it fundamentally reshapes how an entire country relates to its cars. In 1951, just 6 years after the end of the war, Japan established a mandatory vehicle inspection system now known simply as Shaken, short for Jidosha Kensa Toroku Seido, roughly translating to the automobile inspection and registration system. New vehicles get their first inspection 3 years after purchase, then every 2 years after that. Commercial vehicles like taxis and buses face annual inspections without exception. This is nothing like the loose safety checks that exist in parts of the world, where an inspector glances at your brake lights and waves you through. The Shaken examines braking systems, steering components, suspension geometry, exhaust emissions, headlight alignment, structural rigidity, and even whether your speedometer reads accurately at 40 kilometers per hour on a dynamometer. If even one component falls outside the government's exact specification, the car is legally barred from public roads until it's repaired and retested. There's no grace period. No 30-day fix-it ticket. The car either meets the standard or it doesn't move, and the price tag reflects that thoroughness. A typical Shaken today runs somewhere between roughly $600 and $1,300 through a dealership or general repair shop, covering the inspection fee, mandatory liability insurance, and a weight-based vehicle tax for vehicles that need repairs to pass, or for older cars carrying a heavier tax burden once they cross the 13-year mark. That bill can climb well past $2,000. Owners willing to handle the paperwork themselves through a do-it-yourself inspection route can shrink that cost dramatically, but most people simply pay a shop to handle the entire process. For a lot of owners, that cost eventually exceeds what the car is actually worth, and that single economic fact quietly reshapes the global used car market. When Shaken costs more than the vehicle, owners frequently choose to sell or scrap it rather than pay for the repairs, which is one of the biggest reasons Japan exports such an enormous volume of well-kept used vehicles every year. Cars that would run perfectly well for another decade get pulled off Japanese roads purely because of the math, not because of mechanical failure. But here's the part that matters most. The part almost nobody sits with long enough to appreciate. The cars that stay on Japanese roads tend to be meticulously cared for because the people keeping them have already made a conscious financial commitment to that vehicle. Knowing your car will be scrutinized down to the alignment of its headlights every 2 years changes your entire relationship with it. Strange noises don't get ignored. A slow oil leak doesn't get put off until next year. The inspection becomes a forcing function that drags maintenance out of the shadows and into a fixed, non-negotiable schedule, the habits that rarely get explained properly. This is where things get genuinely interesting, because the driving habits themselves are individually so small that most people assume they can't possibly matter. They're wrong, and the reason why is buried in engine metallurgy that almost never gets discussed in casual conversation. Start with something that sounds almost too basic to mention: letting the engine warm up. Not the old ritual of idling for 10 minutes in a driveway, just 30 to 60 seconds after a cold start. Long enough for the oil pump to push lubricant through the entire system and coat the bearing surfaces, cylinder walls, and valve train with a protective film. Here's the part rarely explained. Engine wear is not distributed evenly across an engine's life. It is brutally front-loaded. The overwhelming majority of internal wear an engine will ever experience happens in the first 60 seconds after a cold start, before oil pressure fully builds and that thin protective film coats every moving surface. During that window, metal is genuinely grinding against metal at a microscopic level, and every one of those encounters slightly widens a bearing clearance or scores a cylinder wall. Multiply that by thousands of cold starts across a decade, and the cumulative damage becomes measurable in actual engine longevity. By simply waiting 60 seconds before pulling out of the driveway, a driver eliminates a significant share of that lifetime wear before the car has even moved an inch. Once moving, the driving style stays deliberate, smooth acceleration, early, gentle braking instead of last-second stomping, keeping the engine comfortably in the 2,000 to 3,000 RPM range rather than routinely revving to 5,000 or 6,000. This isn't about driving slowly or timidly. It's about avoiding the two forces that generate the most unnecessary mechanical stress: sudden load spikes and sustained high RPM operation. An engine that spends its life in that gentle mid-range will meaningfully outlast an identical engine that gets regularly pushed toward its red line. And here's the detail almost nobody connects. Smooth driving doesn't only protect the engine. Every hard acceleration sends a shock wave through the transmission, the differential, the driveshaft, and the CV joints. Every aggressive braking event dumps stress onto the suspension bushings and the caliper seals. Gentle, deliberate driving spreads mechanical load evenly across every one of those components, quietly extending the life of parts most drivers never think about until the day they fail on the side of the road, the fluids everyone else forgets. Japanese maintenance culture treats every single fluid in the car the way most drivers only treat engine oil. Transmission fluid gets changed proactively, long before there's any hint of trouble, not after it starts slipping between gears. That distinction is enormous, because by the time a driver can actually feel a transmission problem, the internal clutch packs and bands have already suffered damage that can't be undone. A proactive fluid service around the 60,000-mile mark costs a small fraction of what a full transmission rebuild costs later. Coolant gets the same treatment, and this is where the numbers get genuinely sobering. Cooling system failures are responsible for roughly 1 in every 4 engine failures on the road today. 1 in 4, and the majority of those failures trace back to a single, entirely preventable cause: corroded internal passages created by old coolant that has lost its anti-corrosion additive package. In Japan, coolant gets flushed on a fixed schedule. Not when it visibly turns brown, not when a mechanic happens to mention it during an oil change, but on a set interval treated as non-negotiable. The long-term difference in engine survival is substantial, and it costs a fraction of what a warped head or blown head gasket would cost later. Timing belts follow the same logic, except the stakes are even higher, in what's called an interference engine. A snap timing belt allows the pistons to physically collide with open valves, and the resulting damage typically means a full top-end rebuild costing several $1,000s. Replacing that belt on schedule, along with its associated tensioners and pulleys, usually costs a few $100s. Japanese drivers treat that interval as an absolute deadline. Elsewhere, plenty of drivers gamble past it, betting the belt will hold just a little longer. Sometimes it does. Sometimes that gamble costs them the entire engine. There's also a much cheaper, far lesser-known habit: adding fuel system cleaner to the tank roughly every 10,000 kilometers, about 6,000 miles. This keeps fuel injectors spraying a clean, properly atomized mist into the combustion chamber instead of a dirty, uneven spray pattern that leads to carbon buildup, lost power, and higher emissions. A bottle of injector cleaner costing around $10 is genuinely one of the cheapest forms of preventive maintenance that exists, and the overwhelming majority of drivers outside Japan have never once used it in the entire time they've owned a car, the notebook that saves engines. Maybe the most distinctive habit in this entire culture is something almost embarrassingly analog: a written maintenance logbook. Many owners keep a running record of every oil change, every fluid swap, every odd noise, every inspection result, by hand or in a simple notes app. In an era where everything is digital and automated, this sounds almost quaint, but that logbook creates a continuous narrative of a vehicle's health stretched across months and years. A mechanic can flip back through the pages and notice that oil consumption quietly crept up starting around 80,000 miles, or that brake wear accelerated right after a suspension adjustment. Connections like that only ever surface when someone has been paying attention over time, not just reacting to whatever problem is loudest today. If any of this is starting to reshape how you think about your own car, this is exactly the moment to hit follow, because we're going deep into the engineering side of vehicle longevity every single week, and the details only get sharper from here. Kaizen. The philosophy underneath all of it. There's a concept in Japanese manufacturing called Kaizen, loosely translating to continuous improvement. Toyota famously built its entire production system around this idea. But Kaizen isn't confined to a factory floor. It shows up in how a chef sharpens his knives, how a gardener shapes a bonsai tree over decades, and it absolutely shapes how ordinary people care for their cars. Viewed through that lens, every one of these habits stops looking excessive and starts looking obvious. Changing oil at 3,000 miles instead of 10,000 isn't paranoia. It's a small, repeated investment that compounds across the life of an engine. Warming up for 60 seconds isn't overcaution. It's eliminating the single most damaging 60 seconds of an engine's daily operation. Keeping a logbook isn't obsessive. It's a system that drags invisible problems into the light before they become catastrophic and expensive. None of these individual habits is dramatic on its own. Together, they routinely produce engines crossing 300,000, 400,000, even 500,000 miles, still running smoothly. There's one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with. Japanese owners and mechanics tend to insist on original equipment or equivalent quality parts across the board. Filters, fluids, belts, spark plugs, all of it. The underlying attitude is that a cheap part introduces uncertainty into a system that depends entirely on consistency. A budget oil filter might perform 90% as well as the original equipment version. But that remaining 10% means microscopic particles grinding against bearing surfaces with every single revolution of the crankshaft. Stretch that small quality gap across 200,000 miles. And it becomes the difference between an engine that's still tight and an engine that needs major surgery. What the newest numbers actually show, the data backs every bit of this up. And the gap has only grown wider in the last couple of years. As of the most recent SP Global Mobility analysis, the average vehicle on American roads is now 12.8 years old, the 8th consecutive year that number has climbed. With passenger cars specifically averaging 14.5 years and light trucks at 11.9 years. On the surface, an aging fleet sounds like it might mean people are getting better at holding on to their cars. But the deeper story is that Americans are increasingly forced to keep aging vehicles running longer, simply because new and used prices have climbed so high. Not necessarily because those vehicles were built or maintained to comfortably reach that age. Meanwhile, Japan's passenger cars typically stay in service for roughly 13 years before being deregistered. A number that sounds almost identical to the American figure at first glance. But the context behind that number is completely different. Japanese cars are far more often retired not because they mechanically failed, but because the cost of the next shaken cycle simply exceeded what the vehicle was worth on paper. The engine underneath is frequently still running strong, so ask yourself which car is actually in better condition the day it leaves the road. The Japanese car typically leaves still running, deregistered for financial reasons while the engine underneath remains healthy. The American car, statistically, is far more likely to leave on the back of a tow truck. The 70% rule. Fleet operators and professional mechanics in Japan take these same principles even further, following what's sometimes described as the 70 to 80% rule. Rather than running a component until it fails, they replace it once it reaches roughly 70 to 80% of its expected lifespan. Brake pads, belts, hoses, filters, spark plugs, all swapped out while there's still usable life left in them. The logic is straightforward once you think it through. A part that fails in service doesn't just fail in isolation. It often triggers cascading damage across other components. A ruptured brake hose can lead directly to a collision. A snapped serpentine belt can send engine temperature spiking within minutes. Even a $5 coolant hose splitting at the wrong moment on the highway can trigger a $1,000 head gasket failure. Replacing parts slightly early costs a bit more in raw parts over time, but it eliminates those cascading failures entirely, along with the emergency tow trucks, rental cars, and catastrophic repair bills that come with them. What you can actually do with this. You don't need a government inspector showing up every 2 years to evaluate your brake calipers to benefit from any of this. You don't need to adopt every single habit described here to see a real difference in how long your car lasts. But the underlying mindset is absolutely worth taking seriously, because it works for a reason that has nothing to do with any secret product and everything to do with attention. Start with the oil, not necessarily locked at exactly 3,000 miles every time, but calibrated honestly to how you actually drive, if your daily routine is mostly short. Stop-and-go trips with a lot of cold starts. Your oil is degrading faster than the highway-based assumptions baked into most manufacturer schedules. And shortening your interval by even 20 or 30% under those conditions makes a genuine difference. Choose quality oil and a quality filter over whatever happens to be cheapest on the shelf. Start a logbook. It doesn't need to be elaborate. A simple notes app entry with the date, mileage, what was done, and anything that felt slightly off is enough. In a year, you'll have a record no mechanic could ever reconstruct from memory alone. In 5 years, that record could be the exact thing that saves you from a repair bill running into 4 figures. Then look honestly at your other fluids. When did you last change your transmission fluid? Your brake fluid? Your coolant? If the answer is genuinely, I don't remember or never, that's worth investigating immediately. A complete fluid service on most vehicles runs a few $100s and can add years of usable life to components that would otherwise cost thousands to replace. Remember that number. Roughly 1 in 4 engine failures traces directly back to a neglected cooling system. A coolant flush every couple of years is some of the cheapest insurance you will ever buy for your engine. And finally, give your engine those 60 seconds. It costs you absolutely nothing but a sliver of your morning, and in exchange, your bearing surfaces stay smoother and your valve-train components wear at a fraction of the rate they would under repeated cold start abuse. No secret formula was hiding somewhere that Western engineers simply overlooked. The engines are essentially the same, the oil formulations are essentially the same. What differs is the relationship between the driver and the machine. In Japan, that relationship is built on small, consistent acts of care repeated over years without exception. In much of the rest of the world, it's built on waiting for something to break and reacting after the fact. Both approaches will get you down the road today. Only one of them is going to get you down the road 200,000 miles from now. Those Toyota taxis crossing 500,000 miles didn't get there because of a special oil blend or a hidden engineering trick. They got there because someone paid consistent attention for a very long time. The sticker on your windshield telling you when your next oil change is due isn't a deadline to procrastinate against. It's a starting point. What you actually do in the miles between those stickers is what decides whether your engine lives a short, painful life or a very long, quiet one. Japan figured this out more than half a century ago. The rest of us are only just now starting to catch up. If this changed the way you think about your own car, follow along for what's coming next, because there's a lot more buried in engine engineering that most drivers never get told. And it's exactly the kind of thing that separates a car that dies at 150,000 miles from one that's still running strong past 500,000.